Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the July 14th edition of Collect Our Cousins. I'm Karen Fleshman, founder of Racy Conversations and of Collect Our Cousins, engaging white people in the struggle for full democracy, a weekly live streaming series on Thursdays at 8 a.m. Pacific. I created Collect Our Cousins to help white Americans like me become more effective in our conversations with white people in our lives, to help us build an embodied anti-racist white culture, in the words of Resmaa Menakem. I'm featuring the people who inspire and teach me the most. White Americans, the battle for our democracy will not be won in courtrooms or in the streets. It must be won in white living rooms, in our neighborhood meetings, school board meetings. As an anti-racist, collecting my cousins often falls to the end of my to-do list. Oh, I'll get to that next month. But I want to encourage everyone watching to write a list of your friends and family you will collect this year. There are 21 million Americans, largely white, who believe that Donald Trump is the legitimate president and political violence may be necessary to restore him. And so today I am very honored and grateful to have Dr. Cori Wong join us. A few weeks ago, Desiree Attaway tweeted this incredible quote from an article by two feminists from 1983, Lugones and Spellman, about how white women need to approach interracial friendships. And as I revisit that article, because I realized I'd read it, but it had been a long time ago, Dr. Wong's TEDx talk on feminist friendship popped up, and I watched it, and I was like, oh my God, I love this message. I love this person. I want to reach out to them, and I'm so grateful to you for making time for us this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be in conversation.
Yeah, please. And for anyone who's watching, please drop a comment what you're watching us on, and where you're watching us from. And if you have any questions for us, we're going to be talking about feminist friendship and healing the divide between women of color and white women. And what, Dr. Cori Wong, why don't you share a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, sure. I'll get us started. My name is Cori Wong. I use she, her pronouns, and my background is in feminist philosophy. Growing up, I think I was always just an inquisitive, curious thinker. And it wasn't until I stumbled into philosophy on accident that I realized that it was what I needed to help me make sense of the world. And so ever since myself falling into philosophy, I have just continued to be a philosopher all through my graduate studies, but I really just live everyday life as a philosopher. And what that means to me is I'm really rooted in the transformative power of being able to understand ourselves and others and our places in the world more critically and differently so that we can shape the world in better ways. And the particular feminist angle on philosophy has an explicitly political lens that's rooted in anti-oppression and trying to make a more just world. So I live and breathe as a philosopher. I work as a consultant. I've got backgrounds in education and teaching, and I have a not very easy to say word that captures all of this for me, which is my philosophy. It's something that I came up with in 2008 because I really do just think that theory is so richly better when it's rooted in our lives, and our lives can be so much better when they are grounded in theories that help us make sense of the world too. So my philosophy has been the thing that stuck as my little like marker for the way that I talk about doing philosophy in a way that's everyday, that's transformative, and that can help us be better people and create a better world.
Wow, I love it. Philosophy.
Yeah, my philosophy. It takes practice. It eventually becomes more natural.
Yeah, but as you're talking, it really reminds me of Angela Davis and how she's always talking about um, theory and practice and praxis, and how
Mhm.
you can't just like pontificate about things. You have to be engaged in the world, and that's where you develop the most. Those are the richest learning experiences. And you're much more effective as an activist and as a change agent when you understand your lineage and know your theory, so that you're not like, oh, why is it this way? Or, you learn so much from previous struggles.
Yeah, exactly. Angela Davis is one of my favorite people to cite as a philosopher when people don't realize how informative and powerful really strong philosophical reflection, practice, and theory can be. And then I think about Bell Hooks too, who talked about the ways that theory provided a sense of home and healing. Just because if you are growing up in spaces that don't reflect back to you the ways that the world like resonates in your own experience, finding people who can put language to your experience can be really a healing process, because then there's this level of connection, realizing you're not alone, and some supportive guide to like help you kind of figure out the contours of your own experiences, in a way that I think can be really empowering too.
100%. So, why don't we start? And I thank you so much, Ray, Carmen, Joe. We got Deshauna. Thank you so much for joining in. It's so lovely to see so many people on here this morning. Thank you. Um, let's talk a little bit about the Lugonis and Spellman article, and who they were, and what they were writing about back in 1983.
Yeah, sure. So Maria Lugonis is one of I refer to her as sort of my theoretical godmother, because over the years, her work has just resonated so deeply with me, in many ways. She's a beautiful writer, beautiful thinker, and gives wonderful imagery and metaphor to help make sense of the theoretical concepts. So some key things that come from Maria Lugonis are really wonderful notions of playfulness and ways to move through the world. She has a concept of world traveling, where really to capture the ways that like, when we're in our own spaces and experiences, like our worlds, there are differences in whose worlds we will travel into, depending on our identities and where we're located within different like social structures. Namely, that like people of color have to navigate through the worlds of white people all the time, but white people are rarely going into the worlds of people of color, and like honestly are rarely invited sometimes because of the violence that can happen or the harm when white people enter into certain spaces. But just recognizing that we might show up differently based on the world that we inhabit or the spaces that we're in, the people that we're around, and that affects who sees us and how we see each other too in our fullness. So Maria Lugonis also has a conception of loving perception, of like the ways that we see people without objectifying them, but really seeing people in their authenticity with a real loving eye, that is to see them as they are, not for what they can be for us or how we want them to be. Um, and she's just beautiful. I love her so much and all of her work. Then Elizabeth Spellman is a white woman who is also a feminist philosopher who's done a ton of work on whiteness and like ways to think about whiteness from a white person's perspective. Her different conceptions, have been really, really great for me. She and others are some of the folks who have informed my own views on whiteness. But together in 1983, they did this really beautiful essay, Have We Got a Theory for You, which is grounded in questions of feminist theorizing. So they're talking about how do we make theory, really questioning this like totalizing trend, coming out of especially like second wave feminism, of what the woman's voice is, and critiquing the fact that the woman's voice has often been assumed to be the white woman's voice, or mainstream feminism reflects the voices of women with power and privilege. So that when we would say something so generalizing as the women's voice, it would often leave out some of the most marginalized women, women of color, women with disabilities, poor women, and on and on. So they have this strong critique in 1983 coming out of, post second wave feminism, to say the white women's mainstream feminist voice is not the voice for all women. And that continues through third wave feminism through to now, where we hear a lot of the critiques of white feminism. That's like language that we have at this point in time. But so to counter that, Ligonis and Spellman wrote this article that is just phenomenal because it's written with both of their voices present. There's English, there's Spanish, and then they indicate when they're speaking together or when they're speaking separately, which is itself a really fascinating practice that isn't often done when there's like collaborative writing, or we don't often identify like whose voice is speaking, which has implications for what they're saying. So I love that they make that really explicit. But as they go about this, like how to do feminist theorizing without being imperialist, without being totalizing, without kind of whitewashing again and dominating it with a white woman's perspective, they one call out what really happens a lot with white women trying to enter into dialogue spaces with women of color. One, they say like, you presume too much of us. You make us, and white women will make women of color into their own image, thus dismissing or diminishing the agency or autonomy of women of color to speak for themselves. So in order to stop that dynamic, which is kind of the imperialist way of theorizing, they say we really need to be able to have a different way of dialoguing. And they say that the means for this is going to be genuine reciprocal dialogue. But they throw caveats on it that say that just doesn't mean that like we all get to speak. There's like inherent power dynamics and a difference in who knows what about the world and about others' experiences that they really navigate these dynamics so expertly and talk about how the differences in working knowledge mean that different people should be speaking. And they also name, I mean, like Robin DiAngelo with the white fragility stuff wasn't the first one to say you're going to be uncomfortable once you start to realize that you don't know a lot of things about the racial realities of a world of white supremacy. Ligonis and Spellman said, you're going to have your whole worldview crushed, basically. And in order to go through that, you need to be prepared to experience that. Otherwise, you're going to ruin the chances for our dialogue even further. So they give really pretty much blunt advice for white women of how to approach a dialogue space, which is to learn to become unimportant, to decenter yourself, to be patient, to recognize that you will be an object of mistrust because there's no reason for anyone to trust you, that people of color will feel probably reluctant to be vulnerable to you because of histories of demonstrated inability to not be harmful. So there's a lot that they say. And because that process for white women in particular to enter into a real dialogue where women of color can have a voice and articulate their experiences, even their experiences of white women, that can be so destabilizing to the worldview of white women that they then go into, why in the world would any white woman want to do this? It could crush your worldview so much and be such a difficult process of coming to awareness and consciousness and a real challenge to like everything you know about yourself and your world, that then they say, well, there's only a couple motivations that we can come up with that would be typical. One, a white person might want to enter into this conversation out of their own self-interest, so they think. But they dismiss that pretty quickly and be like, no, this is going to be too hard for you. That doesn't make sense for it to be your own self-interest. And anything that you might gain from this will be after a long period of really difficult experiences. So it just doesn't fit that way. The other motivation that would probably come up frequently is one of obligation or a sense of like moral obligation. Like I should do this because it's the right thing to do and I want to be a good person. But that obligation is not rooted in the right motivation for Ligonis and Spellman. That they have this part where they say like, that's like someone trying to make love to you out of obligation. Like you're missing the point. Like it's not an obligation to do this. If anything, you have an obligation to stay out of the way. You have an obligation to stop harming us. You have a responsibility to no longer be so oppressive. And to that, you can just leave and make space for us. Like, let us speak for ourselves. You don't need to get involved. But if you do want to get involved, if you do want to have the reciprocal dialogue, if you do want to build relationships and actually like have any feasible chance of working together on a political level, then they say the only motivation that makes sense is friendship out of friendship. Meaning that it's because you care about us. It's because you want to have a stake in our world, because you want to get to know us in our own culture space, that for the sake of the relationship, friendship, you will be motivated to engage in these dialogues out of friendship. So, not out of a sense to make yourself better, not out of a sense of moral responsibility or political obligation, but because you want to be friends and you are a friend. And that's why we continue this conversation. The last thing I'll say is that then they say, well, that's probably not very likely going to happen, because people, again, have really limited capacities and skill sets for how to actually engage in that dialogue. So, as optimistic and clear as they are to say friendship out of friendship is the only way to engage in genuine reciprocal dialogue across our differences, they say that might not be possible. And
Mm.
that's where I came in. I was like, could it be though? Like,
Yes, I love the way you walked us through their argument, and it reminds me so much of my own life, and my practice. So I am someone who is very, very blessed. Although I grew up in an almost entirely white environment, I went to Mount Holyoke, which was very, very diverse, and I began meeting women from all over the country and all over the world who, from different racial, ethnic, socioeconomic backgrounds. And then I lived in I lived in South America. I lived in Europe. I moved to Austin, and had like a very, very diverse friend group. I became active in the immigrants' rights movement. Basically, my entire career, I have worked in global majority organizations. Most of my bosses have been women of color who've been incredible mentors and role models, and held me in loving accountability as I worked through, how do I show up as a white woman in these global majority spaces. Bottom line, I get to 2016 and 53% of white women voting for Trump, and just realizing how among my peers, I'm very unusual in the sense that I have a friend group that is diverse, not just across race, but also across age, sexuality, gender, etc. So I'm like, how can I cultivate this for more women and non-binary people? And so I start hosting interracial sisterhood conversations, because what I find is that all of the same things Lugonis and Spellman were talking about in 1983, and that Audre Lorde was talking about in 1990s, none of it has changed.
mm-hmm. Yeah. No, these are very pervasive issues, and that's sort of the trajectory that I took with my TEDx talk on feminist friendship too, because it's rooted in this article. My motivation for thinking about feminist friendship comes from that line from the Goddess and Spellman of the motivation of friendship out of friendship. And when I talk about feminist friendship, I'm understanding this to be a political practice, like politically significant practice, because oppression and systems of oppression seek to divide us, and they continue to make us feel separate, at the very least, separate and distant from one another, if not harming one another.
Yes.
And
Pitted against each other.
yeah, but with different power dynamics too, to be very clear. Like in this situation, white women wield a lot of power and can do a ton of harm. So we need to be explicit about like who benefits from the distance and who is most disadvantaged by those disconnections and the separations that we experience based on our differences. But so because oppressive systems seek to separate us, then I was like, well, if intimate bonds of closeness, understanding, and like real care could be formed, then that is one on a level already challenging the dynamics of a system that tries to keep us apart and separate. But two, it's only when we have that kind of true intimate knowing and understanding, when we really care about people, that I think we then can understand how to show up in solidarity, how to be the most support, how to be able to offer the best kind of support.
Say that again.
But yeah, like if you And I mean, this isn't an original idea. This is what has been happening through the lineage of feminist thought and people saying, like, we need white women in particular to do better in this way. Like, you can't just theorize about what will be helpful. You have to be in it with us. You have to know us. You have to be close to us in order to be able to support us. So I always phrase that as like, um, how can you love me if you don't even know me? As
Mm,
a real tangible kind of conception of the sentiment that, yeah, if you don't know what the needs are, you cannot show up well in a supportive way. You can't be effective in advocacy or solidarity. And also, I want to also like make sure that we're saying like there's an important piece about not speaking for others, but really being able to let everyone have their own voice for their own sense of self-determination and agency. So this isn't about how to like help other people. This is about actually being in a progressive movement for change that's rooted in love and relationship and community and support that then can change the world, but not just going and be like, hey, what do I need to know about you? So now I can go tell other people for you. That's
mm,
not the approach that we're talking about. So I'm really careful when I talk about feminist friendship because some people will take that to be like, oh, I just need to go make new friends in a very like tokenizing kind of way. Um, so when I talk about feminist friendship, it's actually like, no, most of all, people need to be able to do the work on themselves first to actually be capable of friendship, to be worthy of friendship with people across differences, so people will want to be friends with you, actually, more than
yes.
anything. Instead of having it be in the case of like white women, if we're using this as our major frame right now, um, wanting to be liked by other people or wanting to be friends with other people. Like people should want to be friends with you if you're doing it.
100%. 100%. And what I found is that uh, women of color have a much more collective, not to generalize, but to have a much more collective, transformational, long term friendships.
Hmm.
And white women often have these kind of superficial, transactional friendships. And so there's like a difference in style of friendships, or even in an understanding of what friendship and solidarity is. I think there's not a lot of solidarity in white women friendships. I mean, there can be some like, I'm there for you in your times of trouble,
Mhm.
but not to the degree that there is with women of color. And I, in my own experience, like, I know that I had to earn trust by showing up consistently over a long period of time. The trust is earned. You can't just like immediately show up and everything is you're welcome. There's a lot of suspicion. Why are you even here? What are you doing here? Are you here yeah, what is your motivation in being here? And are you here, are you going to cause harm, or do you know how to come correct?
Mhm. Right.
We have a comment from Bo Stubblefield. Thank you for joining us. Hi, I've been a black male feminist for over 50 years and married to my wife, who is white, for over 30 years. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Audre Lorde and particularly her criticism of white feminists in The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House.
Yeah. Um, well, thanks for the comment. And that's another really fabulous critical essay that is worthy of reading and rereading again and again and again. I think that the key line, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, is often quoted in a way to say that we can't use the tools of oppression to undo oppression. But even that can be a little bit abstract if you don't understand the context of the piece, because the piece is actually Audre Lorde addressing um, mostly white women who organize a conference for women's issues, and then not actually incorporating women of color or more marginalized perspectives from various women across differences at the start of the planning. So instead there's like, oh no, we need to have like a panel with women of color or something. And so this like add-on kind of, again, tokenizing approach is just replicating the ways that white women's voices are taken as predominant and central, and then thus becoming the master's tools of, we're still going to be, if we still focus on only centering white women's experiences, then we're not doing anything very different. But the key thing about Audre Lorde's piece is that she's really talking about our differences. So actually the master's tools, as I was saying earlier, is like oppressive systems use our differences to categorize and divide us against each other. And my favorite piece about that the essay is that Audre Lorde says, and this is all coming from memory, I didn't like review this piece, but she talks about how we need to, instead of use the master's tools, which identify our differences as the things that separate and divide us, we need to make that which divides us something that we can actually define, to then be able to become the creative spark, like that which empowers, emboldens, and provides even more power for our creative generation of alternative ways of being. So divide and conquer must become define and empower. And
Mm.
that's where changing from using the master's tools to divide and conquer and separate us, our differences can be something of the most powerful generative resource if we can learn to define our differences, not diminish them, not try to find out where we're similar beneath all of that, but really embrace the fact that our differences are a powerful place to be operating from. If we define that and then empower out of that, that's really what Lord is talking about, is to use our differences to our greatest strength and advantage, rather than letting them continue to be the things that divide and separate us.
Yes, I love the essay Age, Race, Class, and Sex, where she talks about women redefining difference and
Mm-hmm.
how, this is exactly why we've made such limited progress, because every time we come together and try to make social change, we only know how to relate to each other in hierarchy, and we
Mm-hmm.
keep replicating oppression. So she says, in order to actually make social change, we're going to have to create patterns of relating across differences equals, because no one has established those patterns for us. We don't have them to follow. We're going to have to be the ones to do it. And in a
Mm-hmm.
way, I feel that energy right now. I feel that energy in the reproductive justice, civil disobedience that's been happening since the Roe v. Wade overturn.
Yeah. Do you want to say more about that?
Oh no, I'm just curious if you've been feeling that too.
um, I think, well, I mean, there's a lot of critical commentary that's constantly coming up anytime there's a wave of new movement and energy from white women. Like whatever
Mhm.
triggers the enthusiasm and rage and passion of white women is usually very validly coupled with a critique of like, so where have you been this whole time? And
Yes.
what about all the other issues that continue and have persisted that you are not so excited to fight and challenge? Um,
Hmm.
and I think that that is the historical reality, which is why we are where we are.
Yes.
That, it's this kind of selective emphasis of when something becomes just so atrocious that it affects me as a white woman, that now I'm going to be so angry, that the differences in experience have been so utterly dismissed, that what I see that as is an actual just lack of care leading up to it, that it reflects then the lack of care for those who are not yourself, or identify within your own group and community, probably because maybe you don't have the kind of relationships that can reveal what the issues and the experiences and the hardships and the challenges are. But also, I mean, I'm kind of going to go in a different direction right now, because there's something else here that I don't want to just keep framing this as, not being able to see the hardships and challenges. That's a very white perspective to take, because whiteness and privilege in general, when it's coming from this dominating positional perspective, fails to think about what else is missing from the
Mm,
picture that's positive. So if you're in a conference of white women, as Audre Lorde was like, what the hell is going on here? The other thing that's indicated by that is that the organizers are not recognizing that there's anything missing from the conversation. They're
mm,
not missing the presence of women of color. They're not recognizing that this is actually a degraded space because it's so limited in the
mm,
perspectives that are here. So there's a lack of care, there's a lack of appreciation, there's a lack of value, there's a lack of want for more of the whole experiences of an entire community of people that reflects that difference, because that's seen as enriching, because that's seen as powerful, because that's seen as a real resource of value. And so what I'm trying to get at is that if there's always this notion of, oh, I don't know what the hardships and the challenges are, that's just one side of the coin. It's likely that you also then don't know what the joy and the power and the celebration is,
and the wisdom.
the wisdom, the creativity, the history, the various different modalities and practices that different cultures, different communities have, because this has been a mechanism of not just survival despite of oppressive systems, but like being able to cultivate what a thriving community can look like. And right now, where we are at kind of collectively is that we do not have a holistic sense of what a thriving democratic community could look like
Mm,
on a much larger scale, because we just don't, given our power structures, white supremacy, colonization, everything, we don't operate out of how do we make sure our entire community can thrive. We're coming
right.
from systems that are focusing on certain groups having all the power and dominating over others. And so we don't have a history collectively on the broad scale of our entire country to know how to build thriving communities. So people coming from whiteness are not going to have much of those resources either, not none of the insight. So then everything's new, and we're all trying to stumble into our first steps of awareness and how to do this work, when again it's that itself misses the fact that there is a lot of resource and history and tradition and lineage and culture that otherwise could be tapped into. So if we inverted the ways that we approach these problems, instead of saying what do white people need to learn, and we say, hey, wait a minute, what if we do what Lugonis and Spellman say and decenter ourselves, deprioritize ourselves, maybe even just step out of the way and make space for the voices of others who have not been heard because we've been dominating the space so much. Maybe not only would we have a lot to learn, but we could actually all benefit because there's more to work with rather than people just trying to figure it out right now for the first time.
100. I loved everything you just said so much. You
This
know,
is,
if we could listen to the wisdom and
mhm,
center the leadership of Indigenous women, Black women, queer women, non binary people, there's so much there. Um, and then combine it with the numbers and resources of white women, but in a decentered way, that we are the followers, supporters, co-conspirators, but not the definers of the strategy or um, the setters of the agenda.
mhm.
When 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 Black and Indigenous women thrive, all of us will thrive.
Yeah. There's I'm trying to think of a couple other points just to kind of like round out some of the things that have been said. I mean, one of the key pieces that comes from radical women of color from the 70s and 80s, like This Bridge Called My Back, is one of my favorite books ever.
Yeah.
And there's a common sentiment that runs throughout much of those works that you'll get from that time that says, like, it's not for white women to invite us into a movement, because that is again still assuming that this has always been a white women's movement and there haven't already been organizing efforts and entire histories and movements all existing among women of color already. So that's the other piece of, like, just because it's new for you doesn't mean it's new for others, and just because you are being critiqued doesn't mean that you're the one to still hold the power to invite other people in. Like, again, that's flipping it around of, like, you should be worthy of friendship. People should want to be friends with you. You should hope that people will invite you into their movements if you're coming from a position of power and domination as like a white woman. That's when you know that you're doing something right, if you are actually being invited in rather than you assuming that you're the one to try to include others now. So that's something that's yeah, I think helpful. But the other piece I wanted to go back to just on friendship is that as I did the TEDx talk on feminist friendship, my idea there was like, okay, people are struggling to figure out how to show up. I did that in 2017, right after the Women's March, which again was one of those moments when white women got really upset, went to the streets, kind of like the cycle that we're seeing again now repeat itself with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. That there were strong critiques of what happened at the Women's March, even when millions of people across every continent of the world got on the streets to march against the inauguration of Donald Trump as our president of the United States. But all of that was really couched in this notion of if we want to be doing political work and organizing, we have to be able to situate ourselves with the insights from people like Lugones and Spellman. So let me model it after friendship in a way where we could say, you probably already do this stuff with your friends. So show up with others the way you do with your friends, because you presumably care about your friends and you would act out of care and you would seek their best interest and you would believe and understand their experience and want to know, how can I support you? So I did this kind of parallel modeling of if you show up this way with your friends, do those similar things if you want to show up and kind of work across difference in a more political space. But what I was really kind of surprised, maybe disappointed, reality checked with, was that I heard from a lot of people where they were like, oh, I don't think I'm a very good friend. Like, I assumed too much that we knew how to be good friends. And so maybe that goes to your point of just like what like longevity of relationship looks like, what it really means to have meaningful, intimate bonds of like real connection. And I think that that's something that many people struggle with in general. I'm sure that there are differences based on backgrounds and cultural, experiences that influence one's ability to connect or how they connect. But I was really kind of surprised that I heard from so many people that they learned more about how to be a good friend more than they did how to engage in social justice work across difference. Because we're like, we need more of that preparatory preliminary work of like, how do we actually even be friends in the first place? We can't just transfer the skills we don't have yet. So I focus a lot now, even after feminist friendship, like, it's not that I'm beyond that work, but I am realizing as I've moved into spaces, like as a diversity, equity, and inclusion professional, consulting with different organizations, people are wanting to have these conversations and dialogues, or they'll say, we want to be an inclusive and equitable organization. But for the most part, a lot of people lack the basic tools, skills, and abilities to even connect with people who have different experiences. Simple things as like listening, apologizing if you make a mistake or hurt people, doing your own research because it's your interest, like you are committed and wanting to learn so that you can show up instead of demanding that people teach you all the time. These are just like really common things that come up interpersonally. But the other thing that it's like a subtle point in the TEDx talk that I realize is becoming more of a prominent thing for me as I have continued to engage in this work over the past decade. In my TEDx talk, I say, okay, before we get into any of this, one thing we have to be clear on: oppression is bad.
Yes.
And it seems like, a simple point. And so I just like took it for granted. I was like, good, one, oppression's bad, great. Now we can get into the work. But the other thing is that, like, I don't think people really have spent enough time understanding, like, do I really believe that oppression is bad? Am I really bothered by violence and domination? Am I really so committed to a world of liberation where these forms of oppression, this is what we need to end? Because I think that people jump to, oh no, I want to be a good person and I want to help others, rooted again out of those kind of misguided motivations, rather than being grounded in a purposeful sense of like, what is the ultimate project here? The ultimate project here is to end oppression. And we don't often talk about oppression. So again, as a consultant, as a DEI professional, and then as a community member, like, there's so much talk that happens up here of like, how can we do better? But there's not enough talk to be like, Do we actually agree that oppression is bad and it shows up in these ways? Because that's the problem we need to be addressing.
Yes,
And
100%.
people skip that all the time.
And as you're talking, what's coming up for me is capitalism.
Yeah.
I think it's capitalism that leaves us unable to have friendships with each other. It's capitalism that is deeply tied to systems of oppression,
Mhm.
and that has us all thinking, oh, if Cori succeeds, then that's bad for me. Something has been taken away from me. And
Mhm.
the only way that I can succeed is if Cori doesn't succeed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you've been taught that belief system in your family, at your school, when the entire vision of what success is deeply rooted in that kind of paradigm, the natural outcome is you become an adult and
Mhm.
you don't know how to relate.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when people, I think I focus a lot on whiteness and white supremacy too, which is deeply rooted in capitalism. They're all connected. But I think about like when people get offended of critiquing white supremacy or whiteness, it's like, what kind of world do you want to live in? I don't understand. Like if we say whiteness is a system of power and domination, or I talk about whiteness as that which upholds white supremacy. It's kind of like the baseline of like white supremacy is bad, right?
And
Like,
it's bad for white people too. It's not
yeah.
it's not like, oh, white supremacy ends and um that's collective liberation for white people
Hmm.
too. It's a death cult, people, as we have seen in this January 6th uh hearings. It is, we are being fed lies, and manipulated, and it is literally, we are withering, we are dying from it too.
So in the
So
last few minutes, if I can, I
yeah.
think there's a real opportunity then here to recognize that some of the work that I think we all need to be make sure that we're doing is to like prepare ourselves and ready ourselves for the real work of like building connections, community, and cultivating practices of not just resistance but liberation and on alternative ways to be in the world with one another. That requires a lot of self-reflection and a willingness to be, as the Gunnarsson Spellman said, like to deconstruct and kind of go through that implosion of your worldviews. But the thing that I think we also, especially people of whiteness, fail to have is a deep connection to what the alternatives are beyond
Mm.
oppression is bad, let's get rid of it. White supremacy is bad, let's get rid of it. It's this negative, like taking away of the things, even if they are power structures that are horribly violent, without an equal investment of imagination and energy and commitment into understanding what the alternative, better future, more just world looks like, so that people will sort of consciously or unconsciously get defensive because they're like, you're attacking what I know. But that should be an indication that you have not reflected enough on getting to know a better alternative of a
Yes.
liberatory kind of option. So that's other work that I really encourage people to do is like spend time thinking about what the other world we want to be making is and move towards that rather than clinging to the systems of power and domination that have been all of what you've known so far.
Yes, there's a famous quote from a philosopher whose name is eluding me, that in order to reach for the gold, you have to let go of the rabbit pellets that you are so tightly
Mm,
clutching. But that's what you've always known. and
yeah.
and what else is coming up for me is something my mentor Sweetwater Nanook says. She's a native Alaskan healer and activist, and she says, so the reason why white activism is so ineffective is because it's rooted in fear and anger. And the reason why Native activism is so effective is because it's rooted in spirit and love.
Hmm. Yeah. And that's, I think, a message that I often try to share when I'm talking about how to move beyond white supremacy and eradicate whiteness and white supremacy is to develop an identity that is not rooted in white supremacy, which again is kind of like going, what does it look like to have a more liberatory alternative? Like, how can you connect to the lineage, the history, the tradition, the practices, the values, and the wisdom of those who are articulating a better future? But practically speaking, what that looks like is like, um, I really think that instead of feeling guilty and ashamed or frustrated and defensive or insecure and now uncomfortable because you're a white person and you're learning all of this stuff, some of those capacities that could be developed are actually like how to center yourself in gratitude for the fact that so many people over many generations have actually been fighting this fight and now you can do it. How to center yourself in humility of recognizing that there's so much room for you to grow instead of being defensive and feel like you're being attacked. Actually, humility and gratitude could be places to center from a much more productive place.
Mm.
And then like even curiosity and like the enjoyment of the process of knowing that there is a better world possible and you can be an agent in helping to create that instead of feeling like, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do and this is like so like vulnerable or I'm so insecure about all of this. Like coming from a place of gratitude, humility, there's all these other ways affectively to orient yourself to be able to participate productively in moving in a progressive direction collectively that doesn't have to be rooted in these tropes that so many people have adopted of like white people get defensive, white people cry, white people feel uncomfortable, and now we're sad because we don't know what we're doing, and all the people are going to be coming at us, and it's like those are all the wrong emotions to be centering yourself in. Let that go and ground yourself in different states of being in awareness that open you up to actually being able to show up well.
And positively.
That's
Yes.
that's why I do positive philosophy.
Yes, I love it.
I
And I have a great book for white people who are struggling. So many of my mentors said, "Karen, learn about your ancestors." I'm like, "My ancestors? My ancestors are the oppressors. I don't want to learn anything about them. I want to distance myself as far away from them as I can. I want to be a good ally and accomplice and hang out here with you." They said the best accomplices know their ancestors. And we don't need you to hang out here with us. We need you
Mhm.
to go collect your cousins.
Right, yeah, exactly.
So finally, it got through my stubbornness, and I was like, oh well, if so many people are telling me the same thing and I deeply respect them, perhaps there's some wisdom there that
Mhm.
I need to pursue. And I highly recommend this book, The Caliban and the Witch. I was speaking about it earlier, which is a history of the witch hunt in Europe and really how, in order to institutionalize capitalism, the elites broke the peasants' resistance to it by burning women at the stake. Any women who resisted or who were healers or midwives had their own businesses. Basically, it's like women like me, if I had been in that time, would
Mhm.
have been burned at the stake in a public spectacle of violence in front of my own children. And this gave me so much insight into why white people behave so defensively and all of that. It's rooted in our intergenerational trauma from
Mhm.
that period where we learned that, in order to be safe from violence, to align ourselves with the most violent and become violent ourselves.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. Can I offer a few books too to recommend?
Sure. Yes. Thank you.
Um, I already mentioned it, but This Bridge Called My Back is a really
Yes.
important classic one that like I think it's truly life-changing. Um, one of my teachers, Charles W. Mills, wrote The Racial Contract, which is a little bit heavier in political philosophy, but it has the most life-changing concept for me of an epistemology of ignorance, talking about white supremacy as a global political system. It's a short book, but it packs a punch. So
Say the name again.
The Racial Contract.
The Racial Contract.
And then the one that I think, especially for white women to read, is Mickey Kendall's Hood Feminism.
Yes.
The movement that women forgot. And that is, I think I just got that subtitle wrong, but Mickey Kendall's book is, I think, one of the most important ones for especially white women who are coming into this conversation and hearing a lot of the critiques of not being intersectional. Hood Feminism is a real solid account of what equity looks like, what intersectionality looks like, and actually how to support the people who have commonly been the ones to be the most left out because of the ways that we talk about feminism and antiracism and social justice and activism. So I highly, highly, highly recommend Hood Feminism.
Thank you so much. And I highly recommend people join us next week on Collect Our Cousins, where my guest is Lacia Michelle, who is an incredible author, organizer. She is a huge presence on Twitter, and her new book is coming out for white allies. And I highly recommend tuning in next week to Collect Our Cousins. To conclude our conversation, which is interesting, just last week, I also interviewed someone from Colorado, and I'm going to be interviewing Syra Rao and Regina Jackson, who are from Colorado. This is like the Colorado series of Collect Our Cousins, and I'm going to be having a special guest at a different date and time who's also from Colorado. So I'm really excited that you were able to join us, Cori. Please share where, if you were to tell white people to start doing something or stop doing something, or white women, what would it be and why?
Oh, well, that was what I was hoping to get at with those book recommendations. Like, okay. I mean, the easy, most practical thing is like, read Hood Feminism and
Excellent.
really soak it in just to learn about it. I mean, I think the stuff that we've been talking about now is like decenter yourself, reroute yourself in different affective states, and get recommitted to like, why does this matter to you? Like, oppression is bad. What's the alternative? Are you really operating from that kind of perspective? And if not, then stay grounded in a purpose and value towards liberation and figure out what that means to you. Like, understand how to root into a different cultural history that already has articulations for what the world could be like. This isn't new. It doesn't have to be new. You're not making it up. So learn from teachers and be open to the transformative experience that will happen when you learn. If you don't change, the world won't change. So be open to all of that. Excellent.
Thank you so much. And where can people follow you and see more of your work?
Yeah, my website is coriwong.com. You can contact me there too. I have information about positive philosophy consulting there. I do writing in lots of different places, including I have like a Buy Me a Coffee page where I've moved to do some of my more personal reflections. And that's just buymeacoffee.com/Cori Wong. And I'm on Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Some of those are my philosophy, if you can't find me. But yeah, it's I'm kind of all over the place. Just Google my name and you'll find me. My website's a good place to start.
Thank you so much. I'm just pulling. I didn't realize I didn't see so many of these amazing comments. For minority women, especially Black women, survival depends on it, literally life and death, because we depend on each other for safety, network, love, family, and the systems one guarded against us. Yes. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Yvonne.
And I didn't see these comments either. So Jamie, I just want to give you a shout out. Thanks for showing up so strong in these comments. Thank you.
Genuine and honest dialogue with underrepresented groups of society is a good way to build trust. I have to say that specifically the Black community have been incredibly gracious and welcoming, and I have been humbled by the love I've received just by showing up. What a fantastic response, Cori. The essay is included, sister. outsider. Oh my gosh, there's
Yeah.
so many. I'm so bad. I'm sorry. I should have been bringing these up here.
And I really appreciate your comment, Bo, about like my biracial identity being I'm half white and half Chinese, and so I think that a lot of people, I don't know, I like to be really clear with people that the work that I've done has been largely rooted in unpacking and understanding my own whiteness. Growing up in Idaho, coming from a mostly white family, growing up in predominantly white spaces, living and working in them, that when I talk about whiteness, I'm so committed to the process of helping others unpack and unlearn whiteness and white supremacy because it's been my journey too. And for me, it did start really with The Racial Contract. That was the book that kind of opened up my whole mind to be able to see like, oh, this is what that means. This is what it looks like. So even though I identify as a person of color and am half Chinese, like so much of my commitment to this work is because of my own experience and process of unlearning whiteness and really becoming much more fluent and understanding white supremacy.
Yes. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Please do tune in next time. Please do watch Cori's talk on feminist friendship. If you haven't watched it already, it's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, Cori, and everybody here this morning. And we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.